In the infamous Honey Island swamp of Louisiana, there have been stories for decades of something strange lurking in the area. From sightings of large hair-covered creatures, to accounts of blood-curdling screams by seasoned hunters. Footprints of dubious origins have been found, and the story gets complicated and about as clear as swamp water. Join me as I take a deep dive into the story of the Honey Island swamp monster. There's just something about swamps that I find interesting. Many people fear what lies in them, between the bugs, to the reptiles, both large and small, to the dark and murky waters. The swamp is certainly a unique environment. While being personally more at home somewhere in the mountains, I've had the chance to explore quite a few swamps in recent years. From areas in South Florida in the Everglades, to the infamous green swamp of Central Florida, to areas in Louisiana like the Atchafalaya Basin, and elsewhere in the American South. Before we continue, just a brief word from our sponsor. The environment around us is a precious resource that can be critical to our health and way of life. Unfortunately, sometimes unscrupulous people are willing to jeopardize this balance in favor of profit. With recent tragic news like the East Palestine, Ohio train derailment, we are reminded of this assault on the environment around us, and ultimately our health. Morgan & Morgan is currently involved in suing Norfolk Southern over the East Palestine disaster. If you have been affected by the train derailment, or something similar, or even a work-related injury of any sort, you shouldn't feel bad about suing for compensation. Well, in this case, size definitely matters, and in terms of law firms, Morgan & Morgan is the largest injury law firm in the United States, operating in 49 states and with over 800 individual lawyers and 4,000 case staffers. The best part about choosing Morgan & Morgan to represent you is the fee is free unless you win. You heard that right. There are no upfront costs or sign-up fees. This includes all paperwork, research, witnesses, negotiations, and court hearings, free of charge unless you win your case. Go to forthepeople.com for more info. Perhaps no place better embodies the spirit of the swamp than Louisiana. The state contains over 3 million acres of swamp-like habitat. The word bayou is synonymous with Louisiana and describes a slow-moving stream in a swampy section of a river or lake. The word bayou finds its origins as a French term taken from the Choctaw word for small stream, called bayouc. Louisiana as a state has had a very unique history when it comes to human beings. Over the centuries, this area has changed hands many times, from the various native tribes, to being a colony of both France and Spain at separate times, to being a part of the United States, as well as part of the Confederate States during the Civil War, and once again part of the United States, where it has remained. Culturally, it is unlike much of the rest of the U.S. Its deep French history has remained quite strong, both from French colonial times and especially from the influx of French-speaking Acadians expelled by the British from modern-day Eastern Canada during the French and Indian Wars in the 1700s. These people are now known as Cajuns. Whether it be French, Creole, Cajun, African, or other influences, Louisiana has become well known for its mix of cultures. Things like Mardi Gras and Cajun cooking are now known the world over. New Orleans as a city is recognized for its history, architecture, nightlife, and even tragedy.
We're one of the most haunted cities in the United States, and there's many reasons for that. This area has been known for its pestilence and death on top of death over 300 years. We had major fires that burned down the entire city. We had yellow fever epidemics for 200 years that killed people by the thousands, numerous wars, and so forth. And we've also got a very high crime rate, which has been so since the beginning of time, because this was, after all, a penal colony for the French in the 1700s. So we've got a lot of tragedy in New Orleans that has occurred over the years, especially with the hurricanes and floods and so forth, as most people are familiar with. And we're one of the few cities that no matter where you go in the city, you're probably standing where someone has been buried. Just about anywhere you go, there's probably a burial ground right underneath you. If it's not one from the colonial era, it could possibly be one because the Indians at the time used to use a lot of the swamplands around the areas to bury their dead as well.
Behind all of this human history have been the swamps of Louisiana. They have played quite a role as a backdrop in where much has taken place. As a result, the swamps have taken on quite the folklore.
It's very popular to have stories about pirates in the swamp down here. That's a very common legend. Anywhere you go in South Louisiana, you're going to have that because we had pirates here. Pirates traditionally, in the early 1700s, were French, such as the famous Jean Lafitte. And basically what these guys were doing was they were going out into the ships and going out into the Gulf of Mexico, into the Caribbean, and traditionally they were robbing Spanish ships. They're robbing Spanish ships and they're bringing the goods back here to a home base. And it's interesting because they've got some great folklore and legends that go along with them, because it's said that the way that they kept their goods, they didn't keep a lot of it. What they couldn't sell in, say the French Quarter in Pirates Alley, there was always a place that they could go and sell some of the stolen goods, some of their contraband. But some of the things that they wanted to hold on to, it said that Jean Lafitte would bring it into the local swamps and bury the treasure in the swamp. Now the legend has it that he would also shoot one of his pirates and bury him with the treasure so that his ghost would guard the treasure and prevent anybody from getting it. Now the local legend about what was called the fifilet, which is basically a blue light that people have seen in the swamps, and a lot of people might call it swamp gas. But the legend of the fifilet is that is the spirit of the ghosts of the pirates that Jean Lafitte killed to guard the treasure. So we do have a very rich legend area around here with ghosts and also with strange creatures. We of course have the Cajun werewolf, the rougarou. And interesting because the Choctaw Indians also had a creature that they called a rougarou. And the Choctaw legends of the rougarou was more of a Bigfoot creature, very similar to the stories that we hear today about the different types of Bigfoot or skunk apes or so forth.
Of all the swamps in Louisiana, perhaps none stand out more than the Honey Island Swamp. Located just 45 minutes north of downtown New Orleans, the Honey Island Swamp straddles the border between Louisiana and Mississippi, with the Pearl River being the border between the two states in many places. While only being a fraction of the size of the much larger Atchafalaya Basin Swamp, it is still quite an expansive habitat, roughly covering 70,000 acres, about 20 miles long and 7 miles wide. Roughly 35,000 of those 70,000 acres are protected as part of the Pearl River Wildlife Management Area. Just to the north of that is the Bogue-Chitto National Wildlife Refuge, which protects an additional 36,000 acres of Honey Island Swamp and Pearl River Basin habitat. The swamp is home to dozens of species of birds, reptiles, amphibians, mammals, and other wildlife. It was originally named for an island within the swamp itself that was home to many honeybees. Today, the Honey Island Swamp is considered to be one of the most pristine swamp habitats in the United States.
I would best describe the Honey Island Swamp as one of the most primitive areas in the state of Louisiana. We do have a lot of swampland here and a lot of open land with water, but there's just something eerie and strange about the whole ambiance down there. You've got the Pearl River, which is often very high and often floods its banks. You've also got the surrounding swamp areas, and throughout my entire life, we all heard the rumors of the monster in the Honey Island Swamp, and it was someplace that you did not want to go.
According to legend, the Honey Island Swamp Monster is said to be a hairy man-like creature that inhabits the remote areas of the swamp. Typically, the swamp monster archetype from popular culture is one of a more reptilian-looking monster, such as the classic creature from the Black Lagoon, or something made of swamp muck like the comic book creature from The Swamp Thing. But these reports of real-life swamp monster sightings are typically more Bigfoot-like, whether it be the Fouke Monster of Arkansas, the skunk apes of Florida, swamp ape stories, to wood boogers and many other names. They are generally more similar than different. Descriptions of the Honey Island Swamp Monster are generally that of a Bigfoot-like creature, with shaggy hair, not unlike other southern Sasquatch stories. But there are allegedly some differences, which has become somewhat of a contentious part of this legend. While there are Bigfoot-like reports from across Louisiana dating a few hundred years back, it wasn't until the 1970s that the story of the Honey Island Swamp Monster would become more widely known. The 1970s in general were a time known for strange paranormal stories from across the world. By this decade, the infamous Patterson-Gimlin film of 1967 was well known, and in 1972 came The Legend of Boggy Creek, which was a first-of-its-kind docudrama that largely introduced the idea of Sasquatch-like creature stories existing in the American South. As for the Honey Island Swamp Monster, the story goes that in 1963, two men named Harlan Ford and Billy Mills encountered a strange creature while on their way to a hunting camp deep in the Honey Island Swamp. They claimed it was initially on all fours, digging for something in the ground, but then proceeded to stand on two legs and run off. Harlan Ford described the creature as large and baboon-like in nature, but with human-like eyes. After this encounter, Ford grew interested in the mystery and allegedly found a variety of strange four-toed footprints in the swamp, including this one in 1974. So this is a replica of one of the Honey Island Swamp Monster tracks. Now when I look at it, I see some red flags. Biologically, this doesn't seem to really make sense. Three-toed footprints, almost looks like a alligator footprint basically. So I don't know, I mean, to me it doesn't really scream credibility. This footprint, in my view, shares a suspiciousness with similar alleged three- and four-toed tracks, like those found in the Everglades, allegedly of a skunk ape, and the infamous Beanfield track of the Fouke Monster in Arkansas. One of the alleged origin stories of the Honey Island Swamp Monster that would explain the unusual tracks is quite comical, whether intentional or not. The story alleges that a train containing circus animals crashed somewhere near the swamp, and as a result, chimpanzees escaped into the wild and eventually mated with alligators, producing half-chimp, half-gator offspring that has resulted in the monster itself. While being completely biologically implausible as the origins of the creature, the crashed circus train is a common motif in many folkloric stories from across the U.S. The Ford track measures to about 10 inches in length and 5 inches wide by the toes. While in Florida recently, I was able to document and cast some large alligator footprints, which bear quite a resemblance to the Ford track, other than the claw placement. Most alleged Bigfoot prints have 5 toes, as that seems to be the norm. Some have suggested either a genetic deformity, or perhaps inbreeding, or even adaptation to living in a swamp as reasons for the 3 toes. But that still seems like a stretch to me. Perhaps the tracks simply aren't real, which would make the most sense, as Occam's razor dictates. There might even be evidence that conclusively proves the Ford track to not be real. In 2003, researcher and filmmaker Jay Michael, alongside longtime researcher M.K. Davis, were shown a pair of shoes with an alligator footprint attached to the bottom, allegedly discovered buried in mud near the area where Harlan Ford had made his hunting camp in the swamp.
That is cool. Take a good look at that. Yeah. Turn it around. Well, I'll be doggone.
According to Jay, the shoes were discovered in the late 1970s, and when confronted about it, Harlan Ford did not confirm or deny anything. At the time, it was known that the tracks were faked, and that local news even covered the discovery of the shoes, but that news never made it out nationally.
Here's the shoe along with photographs of known Honey Island Swamp casts and cast photos, including the original casts cast by Harlan Ford. The shoe print is the same size and width of the casts. It bears the same indentions where the toes begin. Even the telltale tilt of the middle toe can be seen in comparison to this cast photo. The bends and arches of each toe can be easily seen represented in the casts.
With my own rudimentary analysis, the alleged track and fake gator shoe line up quite nicely with one another. Regardless of the track's authenticity, the profile of the Honey Island Swamp Monster continued to grow in the 1970s, and eventually the cult classic show In Search Of with Leonard Nimoy covered the Honey Island Swamp Monster in 1977. As for Harlan Ford, after he passed away in the early 1980s, some of the hype around the monster died down. However, stories and encounters continued to trickle in here and there. It wasn't until the early 2000s that apparently a reel of film was found in Harlan Ford's belongings that showed some kind of barely visible, blurry creature in the brush. I wish I could share the footage with you here, but you'll have to look it up to see for yourself. The footage was alleged to have been filmed in the 1970s, likely inspired by the Patterson-Gimlin footage. However, when I talked to Jay Michael about the fake shoe tracks he had documented in 2003, he mentioned that the alleged footage was released shortly after he had put out that very video refuting the footprints. He felt that the footage was more recent and likely not made by Ford at all. So was Harlan Ford's original encounter real? Did he really encounter a creature in the swamp, or was it all a creative invention, like the tracks in the footage might have been? Was part of it true and part of it invented? Or was it a case of Ivan Marks syndrome, as longtime researcher Thomas Steenberg would call it, where somebody has a potentially real Sasquatch encounter, but then muddies the waters with hoaxing and desperation in order to try and prove something about these creatures? These are all good questions, and in a topic that is unfortunately filled with many hoaxes, all a very real possibility. Even if the Harlan Ford encounter, footage, and tracks are all fabrications, does that invalidate any previous or more recent encounters? Not at all in my view. There have been many sightings and encounters in this area, completely independently of the Ford story. I recently came across quite a few while in Louisiana, as you'll see shortly. The first time I actually visited the Honey Island Swamp was while I was in Louisiana in 2019. I took a tourist swamp tour, which really only showed me a small part of the area. I did, however, get the chance to interview Dana Holyfield, who is the granddaughter of Harlan Ford. Dana has researched and collected stories of the Honey Island Swamp Monster for a number of years. She seemed sincere about her interest in the topic, and from what she told me, many witnesses had contacted her with stories of their encounters in the area. This brief visit to the Honey Island Swamp left me feeling like I had unfinished business with this story, so that is ultimately why I chose to visit the area again recently, to explore and investigate the stories. What I learned was quite intriguing, with implications going far beyond just the geographical area of the Honey Island Swamp. So right this way is the West Pearl River. As you can see, very flooded. It's the overpass here. I mean, the road is being swallowed up by water. One of the first people I interviewed while in Louisiana about their experience in the swamp was a longtime hunter and outdoorsman that Scott from the Bigfoot Mapping Project connected me with.
Well, I'll start off by giving you a little history. Now, this goes way back during my college days. Now, I grew up 6, 7 years old in the woods of South Louisiana. You know, all my life, hunting, fishing, outdoors, you know, camping, all of that. When I got to college, I met a couple of guys, one from Houston who had never been outdoors. The other was from a small town in South Louisiana, but he had no outdoor experience. Well, they saw me practicing with my bows. This is in the early, when bow hunting was just getting started here in the States. And I was practicing, they were interested, they wound up buying each a bow, and I would show what I knew. And then one day they said, well, we'd like to join you on a hunting trip. I said, well, I plan on making a bow hunt in the Honey Island Swamp. I hadn't been there ever. I had been nearby in similar woods, but not technically in Honey Island. They decided to join me. I said, boys, we're packing it in. That is, we're gonna park the vehicles, we hiking in, bring what, and we're staying a couple of nights. And later that evening, we had a campfire, we had a couple of drinks. About 10 o'clock around the campfire, we were feeling good, proud of ourselves of making the trip into the woods. And these two inexperienced, they were loving it. And all of a sudden, I heard a sound I have never heard before. Nothing like any animal, not a pig, not the moaning sounds of a wild cat, nothing like that. It did it a second time. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. The two guys were fearful. They looked at me. Well, Stacy, what is it? They figured I knew. I said, I don't know. It did it twice. The proximity, 100 yards from us. It was a howl, but not a high pitch, more from, I hate to say it, more of a human-like sound, an ape sound of some sort. This was different. And like I said, I spent a lot of time in the woods, and I still do. I've yet to hear that same sound. Now, at the time, you know, people were talking about an old movie that came out, the Boggy Creek Monster or something like that, and I guess that was in the 70s. And it immediately went to my mind. I said, holy smoke, what is this? Well, we stayed the evening, a bit restless, but we did stay the evening. And I still talk about it today. And people say, well, you know, this creature, does it really exist? Is it, I'm not sure what it was, but I can tell you this much. I had never witnessed anything like that, ever. And was I fearful? I won't say fearful like runaway fearful. Concerned that I couldn't identify what this was. Because if it's a bear, if it's a cat, a bobcat, or a hog, I know what it is, I know what to expect. This was a sound like I've never heard before, ever. Was it loud? Incredibly loud. I got the impression that whatever animal was there, not only knew we were there, was letting us know that he was there or it was there and didn't like it. Very territorial sound. And that's all I can say about that. That's all I can say. You know, years later, you know, you hear about, you know, the Honey Island Swamp and this, that, and the other. And I said, holy smoke, somebody else. And that I've never told this to anybody other than my immediate family. And then one day I run across somebody that says, hey, we heard or we, you know, experienced something. Anyway, that's why I'm telling you about it. Because I experienced something. And it was unsettling, to say the least.
And I mean, so you heard obviously then about the stories of the Honey Island Swamp Monster?
At the time, I knew nothing of it. It's not like I knew and said, well, we're going to the Honey Island Swamp and maybe we'll hear a monster. No, it wasn't like that. I didn't even know that.
While not including a visual sighting, what intrigued me about Stacy's encounter was his lack of awareness of the overall Honey Island Swamp Monster story. My next interview was with Kalila Smith, who did have a visual encounter with a creature while driving through the swamp.
I had an experience in the very early 90s that absolutely blew my mind, and to this day I can't explain what it is. Now, I've been involved in ghost hunting and you know, investigating mysterious occult mysteries and so forth for almost 30 years, and this is the one thing that I could not explain. I was coming home from a party. It was late one night. It was in either late January, early February, because it was that time of year that we always get that heavy fog. It's when it's that first cold weather that we get, and the weather changes drastically from the day to the night, and over these waterways a lot of fog forms. So I was coming back late one night from a party, and I was leaving the area of Picayune, Mississippi, which is right past Pearl River, Mississippi. And I was on the interstate, I think it's 55, coming down towards I-10 at Slidell to make it back home to New Orleans. And I was just getting ready to go over the bridge that is over the Honey Island Swamp. The fog was so thick that I really could not see past my headlights. That's as far as I could go. And then everything else was just, you know, gone. So I could see a little bit above my headlights, and that was about it. And I was probably going about 65 miles an hour, and I was in a minivan. So I was not in some tiny little car. And as I was going down the road, I passed something that I couldn't identify. Now, this was an animal. I know that it was an animal. And this thing stood in the midline of the road. If I would have been over another maybe foot, I would have hit him with my mirror. Any other kind of animal would have darted away as soon as those headlights hit. But whatever it was stayed there. And it was interesting because all I saw was its legs. So how tall would it have had to have been for the rest of its body and head to be taller than a minivan? I mean, literally, I saw two legs standing on the midline, and as I passed it, it was so bizarre because I had never seen anything like it. Its fur, and it's ingrained in my mind. I mean, just that one little split, passing it by, I will never forget what it looked like. It had this dirty, gray, matted-looking fur on both legs. And they were big legs. They were about this big, and it was all of this fur. It reminded me of what, like if you didn't shear a sheep and they just got dirty and matted, and it looked like maybe there was some mud in there. And I passed it, and before I could even say, what in the world was that? I smelled the smell that everybody described, that I had heard my whole life, of that smelling like that wet dog, gamey kind of smell. And it had the smell of, unless you grew up down here, you don't understand when I say it smelled like swamp mud. That swamp mud, that mineral mud kind of smell to it, plus a wet dog. And it was just like, I just got this chill because it was like, was that the Honey Island creature?
I know you had mentioned to me before you had thought about perhaps turning around to go see it again. I mean, what was your initial reaction? Were you confused, frightened, or what was running through your mind?
At that point in time, I had a million things running through my mind. I immediately looked into the rearview mirror to see if I could see what it was and make out what it was, and of course it was pitch black. And my first inclination is, let me find a turnaround so I can go back. And as soon as I hit the bridge, there's the sign saying there's several miles before the next exit. So back then, I didn't have a cell phone. I didn't have any type of camera or anything on me to take a picture. And here I am by myself. It's after midnight. I'm out here in the swamp, and it's foggy. And my first thing, do I drive several miles, turn around, come back, and circle back up? And that was, of course, the first thing you think to do. You know, it's that, you know, that Scooby-Doo mentality of, I got to go back and look at this. I've got to go see what this was. And then as I'm driving, I thought, But what if it's not in the center line next time? What if it's in the middle of the road and I hit it? Then what? And I started getting really fearful, and it was like, maybe I don't need to know what it is. Maybe I need to just research this beyond going back there, and that's what I decided to do. I started really getting kind of, that gut feeling you get where you get that sense of just fearfulness, and you go, that's probably not a good idea.
As it was shown earlier in the video, Kalila knows quite a bit about the overall folklore of Louisiana and would have been aware of the stories of the creature. Her sighting, however, is not out of the ordinary. A majority of Sasquatch-like sightings across North America take place on roads or highways. You have the two right ingredients in the same place at the same time, being a human driving on an oftentimes rural road and a Sasquatch either crossing or being seen near the road. I had a few other interviews to conduct while in the area over the next few days, but in the meantime I wanted to see the actual Honey Island swamp, so I met with a local who would take me out deeper into the swamp itself. Alright, so heading out now in the Honey Island swamp, taking this guy right here. You're saying this is the area you think where some of the original kind of sightings happened?
Yeah, that's what I understood, that this Peach Lake area is where the initial first reportings and everything were seen. Peach Lake is a really, really long canal, so I'm not sure exactly where that might have been. My understanding is that he was heading out to his camping area for hunting purposes and everything else, but I'm not sure exactly where that is. Like I said, this goes for miles and miles.
Yeah. And that was back in the 60s or the 70s?
So I think there was like two sightings or something like that. One was in the 60s, and then there was something again that popped up in the early 70s, I think around 74. And that was right about the time we were moving to the area.
Oh, I got you.
And I can remember. Now, I don't know if the initial sighting was in the 60s and tracks were found in the 70s or how that worked, but
yeah. Well, the water is just simply too high. We're trying to find some dry ground, but there's really not a lot of options out here. The river is just so high. So we just stepped off the boat. I mean, we're not even that far from the river, but you can't even see it anymore. It's just thick with all this underbrush kind of covering everything up, and just a lot of hog. Right here, look at that. That's a big slide right there. Kind of slid in there. Digging up here. So is it... Yeah, there's this side. Would they be digging in there for bugs and stuff? Grubs, yeah. There's a hog dig for you. I mean, so what did you see out here? You said you had seen a...
So I was going squirrel hunting one morning and driving down to the management area, and this is back in the late 80s, and had a Suburban at the time, and out in front of me, just right at daylight, I had a pig run across the road in front of me. I was like, holy crap. And so I stopped and just sat there, and immediately behind it, a big cat ran out. I mean, 25 feet in front of my Suburban. Perfect view of it and everything else. Definitely a big cat, had a long tail. Best I can assume is it was a mountain lion, a cougar, or however you want to call it. But that was my only sighting was then. Never really talked about it much, just, you know, and everything else.
And
but
they're not supposed to be here.
well, they're not supposed to be here, but every once in a while you hear people talking about them passing through and everything else.
Yeah.
And I think that's pretty much what I had.
It's still cool. I mean, it still tells you that this area supported an animal like that at one point.
You
so.
just never know what might pass through here from time to time.
Aside from just stories of the Honey Island swamp monster and the occasional mountain lion sighting like James's encounter, the Honey Island swamp is also known for sightings of another cryptid of sorts. This area is known for reports of the critically endangered ivory-billed woodpecker. As one of the largest species of woodpecker in the United States, the ivory-billed woodpecker is mostly deemed extinct by now, with the last documented sightings being in the 1940s in Louisiana. But alleged sightings around the area of the Pearl River have even prompted people like extinct animal researcher Forrest Galante to look for evidence in this area. These stories only seem to add to the reputation of the Honey Island swamp as being a primordial habitat.
You got something right here where, see this? It kind of looks like a footprint, but I think what you're having is some kind of a slide. You see that? I don't know if that's just a natural or what that's from, but somebody could look at that and say, oh, that's definitely a footprint.
Definitely ain't your foot.
But it definitely is not. I don't think it's a footprint.
But you see,
And when there's only one like that, I mean.
but you see, you know, there's the dew claws, there's the point
Yep.
of a pig there. I'm just wondering.
There's not a whole lot here, just a lot of hog evidence. I mean, it just goes on, the woods here. You could, I guess anything hypothetically could be out here, but with the water so high, there's limited areas of dry ground. So that's kind of what we've been looking at in here and just finding a lot of hog evidence, and that's pretty much it, not much else.
Out of here.
Yeah.
It was quite interesting to see deep into the swamp in a way that otherwise would be difficult to access. After disembarking while in the area, I hoped to spend a couple of nights solo investigating areas of interest I could drive into.
Well, I just saw a water moccasin up the road, very venomous snake here. The complication here is that much of the area is now flooded, as this road, I can't get through it with my rental car. So my plans have been foiled a little bit here. I was hoping to camp in this area along the Pearl River. Unfortunately, camping is closed now in the National Wildlife Refuge due to the flooding. I think they say 15 to 17 feet, and then it's closed, so it's above that now. I think it's around 17 feet. So I'm not able to camp. There's not a lot of dry areas. I mean, there's one right behind me, but not much. So it leaves me a little bit of a kind of tough situation. I'm closer to the highway than I'd like to be. You can kind of hear it in the background. But there's still plenty of space here. I mean, there's underpasses that go under the highway for wildlife. So I think what I'll do is probably just hang out in this area tonight. Maybe walk these roads. I can walk them somewhat with my boots as long as they're not deep enough. I might give that a try and just kind of see as a solo investigation out here, see how that goes. So I managed to find a different area in the Bogachita National Wildlife Refuge. It's actually a lot drier. There's a little bit of rolling hills almost here. There's actually kind of a hill behind me. There's water kind of on two sides, but I was able to pull right in, and it's very quiet here. I don't have the highway close by. This is more in the northern section. Looks very wooded, very promising driving in here. I'm already hearing stuff moving around, so what I believe is probably an armadillo or something. I was just scanning with the thermal. There's definitely a lot more water here, in this spot at least. This is where I feel like if something were coming, I'd be able to hear it through the water, at least moving towards me. Just heard a huge splash in that direction. Try to see if there's anything moving in there. Well, I'm exhausted. Probably gonna call it a night here. Just kind of wanted to poke around, see if there's anything going on. Very quiet, somewhat windy night. Not much going on, except bugs.
That morning, I headed for areas north of the Pearl River to meet with a local Bigfoot researcher. Prior to a sit-down interview, we met at a restaurant fittingly named the Swamp Monster in Franklinton, Louisiana.
My name's Eden Boudreau. Live in Washington Parish, Louisiana, and that's where I had my first encounter when I was about 8, about 1973, 72. And we were sleeping at night at my aunt's house, and we didn't have air conditioning, so the windows was open, and they had an attic fan, and the attic fan draws the curtains into the house, and my bed was pushed up against the window, so the curtains was drawn in across me, and I woke up to this growl, snarl, kind of exhale. It's weird. It was like 3 or 4 different sounds all in one. And I looked out the window, and there was a Bigfoot standing there. The window's probably about 6 feet off of the ground. So he had to have been 7.5, 8 feet tall. There was a light in the yard, so he was backlit, so I didn't get a good look at him, but that's how I got interested in it. I mean, I basically grew up knowing that they're real. You know, my grandmother used to tell stories, you know, and warn us about the wood boogers getting us. Since I've been up here, people know I'm interested in the subject, so they reach out to me, and there's sightings, lots. I've probably talked to at least a dozen people that have had sightings, and a few of them real close to where I had my sighting as a child, only they had their sighting like in the 90s.
Eden's childhood sighting took place in Bogalusa, Louisiana, which borders the Pearl River. Bogalusa lies about an hour north of Slidell, Louisiana, which borders the Honey Island Swamp section of the Pearl River. This is essentially all the same continuous habitat.
Well, along the Pearl River you have different wildlife management areas all the way down to the coast from Bogalusa and all the way down. You got the Old River, and then you got the Pearl River, and you got the Bogachita. And so it's thousands and thousands of acres that are just wildlife habitat. But also in Washington Parish, you have a lot of timberland that it's not open to the public. It's gated. They'll lease it to hunt clubs, but you just have guys going in there a few months out of the year. So there's a lot of that too. So there's a lot of undisturbed forests.
Where we currently were for the interview was near Franklinton, Louisiana, along the Bogue-Chitto River, which runs directly out of the Pearl River just north of the Honey Island Swamp.
I've talked to people that have had sightings along the Bogue-Chitto River. You probably saw it when you went past it. It doesn't flood as bad as the Pearl River does. But yeah, there's sightings all along the Bogue-Chitto also. It's the same thing. It's more along the Bogue-Chitto is privately owned land, but again, very few people have access to it, and it's mostly undeveloped.
Now, I know you mentioned a story about a friend of yours or somebody you had talked to. I think it was along the Pearl River that had the dog killed?
Oh, yeah, no. No, he doesn't live along the Pearl River. As a crow flies, he lives maybe 15 miles from here, down that power line. There's a power line right over there. And, yeah, he grew up hearing stories about Bigfoot all along the Pearl River, his grandfather and his uncle telling him stories. So he got out there looking for stick structures and finding structures at his place and places where they could hide along his yard and watch him. And he started having problems with them. They started slapping his house. He recorded vocalizations. They were screaming at him. And he had his dogs. He's got a few bulldogs. He has them on chains. And one had something. He swears it was a Bigfoot, and I don't doubt it. It grabbed his dog by the body and pulled it and pulled its head off. So the collar was still on what was left of the neck of the dog, and the chain was still there, but the body was gone. He said the head was back there about 3 days, and then the head went missing. And then he said about 3 months later, the head showed up in his yard again. So that really disturbed him. It bothered him because, it was his pet.
This was one of the more extreme incidents I've heard of when it comes to the Sasquatch topic, especially with what seems like malicious intent by returning the head of the dog nearly 3 months later.
This is the same power line that runs through the property of my friend that dog got killed. It's the same one. Also, there's another lady, she lives closer to Bogalusa, same power line. And she's had stuff thrown at her, and she had, something thrown at her grandson, and, she says she hears them. And she grew up on the Pearl River. And I was lucky enough, I got to speak to her mother. She passed away a year or so ago. And her mother had all kind of encounters along the Pearl River too. She said, when the river would get up, she said there was a slough back behind their house, and she said she could hear it screaming sometimes all night long back up in there.
So what I've been gathering so far in this area in terms of talking to people, hearing some of these reports, mostly chance, random encounters, as is the case most places, following the rivers, obviously, and these forested areas all along, whether it be from the Pearl River down from Honey Island up into this area in the Bogue-Chitto River, all these linked environments. That seems to be where a lot of the reports are happening. And as I said, most of them are just chance encounters. Obviously, the dog story of the head being ripped off is probably one of the more dramatic ones. I'd love to follow up more on that. I just wish I had more time out here. It's always the problem when in an area only for a few days where you're trying to do multiple things. It's not as conducive, obviously, to something like say, Area A in Alaska, where we were there for basically almost 9 days. Just gives you more time. So I think a lot of these people that live in areas where they have these encounters nonstop, or they're always able to get out in the same area and research, have a little bit of a leg up. I mean, you never really know with this kind of thing. It's always kind of a shot in the dark. But these are just my thoughts in the moment while out and about. And yeah, that's basically it. So here's a great example of the issue here in this part of Louisiana, how much of this land is actually private. So looking on the map here, just the road goes through here, but there is a ton of great forest habitat in this area, tons of logging areas. Apparently it's all controlled by logging companies, so most of it is inaccessible, which is unfortunate. So in this area you really got to stick to basically smaller state parks and the wildlife refuges along the Pearl River, which are flooded. But I'm gonna probably try going back to that area that I was in, check that out again, and see if there's anything in that kind of area, you know, as far in as I can get some of the higher spots where there isn't as much flooding. So that's pretty much one of the best options at this point. Kind of a bummer, can't get into places like that.
For the second night back in the same area of the Bogue Chitto Wildlife Refuge, I took the same approach as last night. I hung around outside, cooked up an MRE to eat, and just listened. I mean, there's just so much out tonight. I'm hearing way distant vocalizations, barred owls, coyotes. Nothing that unusual aside from the kind of knock sounds, but that's not definitive of anything at all. While there were a couple of times I heard what sounded like wood knocks, it wasn't anything substantial overall. There were plenty of animals moving about in the area around me, like armadillos, which I was able to spot with the thermal camera. Aside from that, overall it was quiet. Overnight audio did not reveal anything of interest either. In the morning I planned to explore the surrounding area.
Right, so here's the area. Essentially, this whole side here, this is all flooded. But over on this side, it's a little bit of a hill. It kind of goes up. Probably check out both sides. There's something big splash over here. Maybe it was an alligator. I didn't see anything, but heard something big splash over. I saw water movement, so I think could have been an alligator, maybe a fish. It's pretty loud. I'd guess alligator. So a new piece of gear I'm trying out here in the field for the first time. Something I just got. It's this Hill People gear chest rig, chest pouch. People call them different things. It's really cool. It's basically, you know, like a pouch you have kind of hanging right in the front. It's held on. It feels really comfortable. And this is something that came recommended to me from Joe and Jesse over at Hellbent Hauler. And I've been looking for a way to kind of carry some extra gear without having a backpack or with a backpack. I mean, I've tried a fanny pack before. It just gets in the way when you're moving around. This lets you be pretty free moving, and it has a lot of different functions. So one of the primary functions is it's kind of a holster, actually like a chest holster for your firearm. So what you do is you just pull it out, and then you would have access to your defensive firearm when in the field. You can just pop it right out, and it comes out pretty quick. But that's not the only function. That's obviously a pretty nice one, but with the extra space, you also have essentially a whole area to store stuff. So in here I've got just a hanging flashlight actually. In one section, got my bug net. I've got my Garmin GPS system in here. I've got my Bigfoot Bushcraft fire starting kit, so we've got a whole little kit of those little fire starters. We've also got a lighter in here too. This is a ferro rod in here, so I've also got my Sawyer Squeeze mini water filter, and then I've also got a front pocket, and this is where I keep a full expanding little water pouch that goes with the Sawyer squeeze, so I can just put the filter right on here, and if I don't have any water on me, emergency, I can just fill that up. And then in the front I can also keep something like my wallet, keys, stuff that I don't really want to have in my pocket or necessarily in a backpack. Even if I do have a pack on with this, the idea is if I have to dump my backpack or drop my backpack, I still have my essentials with me, and they're not getting in the way of me climbing or being able to do much. So I'm liking it so far, but we'll see how it does in the long run. Let's go up right through here. Stuff being kicked up over here. Yeah, I'm trying to see if anywhere where tracks might be visible along the shoreline here. Doesn't look super likely. Well, I'm gonna ditch this camera and just stick to the GoPro for now. Helps me be a little bit mobile. Just come back and get that on my way out. You know, people have been in here, older looking bottles. Like a jacket. A lot of this stuff may have actually been brought in via flooding. I don't know if this is, assuming the water has probably gotten higher than this in the past here, so maybe a lot worse than this at certain times of year. Back at water's edge. Gotta watch every step I take. I have yet to see an alligator out here. They're out here. Something's been walking through here. I guess would probably be hogs. That's kind of interesting. Oh, that one looks... Yeah, I'd have to guess hog. Pretty decent sized. Hog digging through maybe. Seems to be a lot of tracks like that right in this one spot. Ugh. Very thick in here. Cool area though. Definitely enjoy it now. Just gotta remember how to find my camera. No, I know where it is. I just gotta follow the edge of the water there. There's the camera. Yeah, where I am now, I'm essentially straddling the border between Mississippi and Louisiana. The Pearl River is actually right over here. That's where all this water is coming from. I'm not that far, but there's just nothing but trees, at least from the map. You got flooded section there and it just goes on. I don't know what else I can really do in here since I can't use a drone. Not allowed in the wildlife refuge, so puts me at a disadvantage for sure. Well, just a little poking around here, nothing crazy. Nice to see there is still this pretty big chunk of dry land amongst all the flooded areas. So, you know, it's tough being able to cover any kind of ground, especially alone like this. So, just glad I was able to kind of get a visual for the area here since I was here last night.
As I left the swamp that morning, while headed towards town, I had cell phone service again. I noticed a message on Instagram somebody had sent me last night, which I was just seeing now. Just finished listening to episode 45 of Bigfoot Crossroads. I heard you may be making an episode of Small Town Monsters in the Honey Island Swamp. Curious if you already filmed in that location. I hunt and fish that area all the time and would love to help in any way possible. I've had a couple scary things happen while hunting the area, but no sightings. Hopefully I caught the episode in time. The podcast he was referring to was my appearance on Bigfoot Crossroads in November of 2022, it now being February. It was all but a brief mention of the Honey Island Swamp.
Do you got any big projects on the horizon?
As I mentioned with some of my bucket list locations, there's always places we're trying to go to. In the wintertime, we usually focus down south. So as I said, we'll be going back to Florida, maybe doing some other locations in the south, Honey Island Swamp, stuff like that.
The timing of his message blew me away. He could have sent that a few days or even weeks later, and I would have already have been done filming in Louisiana. So I ended up giving the man named Dave a call, and he had some interesting stories to share. We eventually met up in the evening and headed into an area he had experienced some strange things in the swamp.
We're currently out here. We're with Dave. You cool with me calling you Dave?
Yeah, Dave.
Yeah. We're here with Dave. You had reached out to me because you had some kind of weird sort of stuff. You'd mentioned you had a history of knowing people and encountering kind of stuff out in this Honey Island Swamp area. And we're in a location where you had something happen. Do you mind just saying a little bit about what it was that happened?
Yeah, sure. Probably like 4 or 5 years ago. Came out October, early bow season. And right down here we have a launch to get onto the Pearl River.
Yeah. And we're on the Mississippi side right now.
Yeah, on
correct?
the Mississippi side. But the Pearl River is kind of, what is, basically the state line.
The border,
right.
right.
Once you cross the other side.
So you're going to hunt in Louisiana, but you're basically just using a Mississippi boat launch and going in from there.
Yeah, right. Yeah,
Gotcha.
We're allowed to, even in the Bogachita, Mississippi people can use the parts that are even in Louisiana if it's
Gotcha.
in the actual Bogachita.
Makes sense.
Yeah. But so yeah, just leaving after hunting one day. Had my boat on the trailer and driving down slow, and out of the corner of my eye I see a big stick just come and smash off the corner of my truck. I get out, pretty freaked out at the time, didn't know what was happening.
Yep.
Kind of took a minute, took a deep breath. I actually called my buddy and was like, I don't know what just happened to me. Big
How thick was this stick? I mean,
it was decent, about baseball size and probably about 6 feet long, and it broke into a couple pieces when it hit the truck. And looked around a little bit, didn't hear anything or see anything, and got back in the truck and was so freaked out I ended up taking a wrong turn and got my truck stuck in the mud, and ended up having to have someone come and get me out. And it ended up being a big ordeal.
was that like the first kind of weird thing you'd experienced out here?
Yeah, for sure.
Okay.
And that was kind of at the beginning time when I was really hunting a lot. I kind of got into hunting later in life.
Sure.
Grew up fishing and kind of needed to try something new, so figured, got plenty of areas to hunt. So.
And how aware were you of the stories of like the Honey Island Swamp Monster or Bigfoot-like stuff in this area?
At that time, somewhat familiar. I had some stories kind of passed on through my uncle growing up, but really only thought that they were kind of, just your typical scary stories that you tell younger kids. And he always told me, no, it's out there,
And do you mind talking a little bit about some of your uncle's stories?
Yeah. He always said that he spent, more time in the swamp than, really anybody else, and he knew it, like the back of his hand. He would build tree stands and sleep overnight, in the swamp. So I can't really imagine, all the things that he heard. And so, one of the main stories that he would tell me was he would go to the end of old Highway 11 in the Pearl River, and there used to be a bridge that crossed over into Mississippi, but it got washed out, years before then. And he would go and make a call, and I don't know if it was every time, you know, but he had several times where something would respond and kind of come to the bank of the river, kind of, you know, maybe knock over some trees, or, you know, have like a type of aggressive display of, you know, kind of aggression.
Right.
And
so he would actually do this call, and this thing would respond and then move towards him.
Yeah. Like, I don't know if, you know, there was some sort of like understanding there that they had, you know, kind of, you know, knew that, or if it was just, you know, the creature just thinking it was a Bigfoot and coming, you know, to him.
Right.
Not really, you know, I don't really remember exactly, you know, how many times he did that, but I know it was several times. And one time he brought my aunt out, and she said she'll never go back in the woods after that, or at least in the Honey Island Swamp. And
Wow. So she experienced kind of the same thing with him?
yeah. And she said something's out there. It's not something that we know about, that's for sure.
Wow. And then what was the time range between when he was out there and kind of when the incident with your aunt? Like, when was that going on?
So he mainly his stories were from the 80s, that he was spending time out there a lot, but with her it was in the early 2000s that they went back.
Interesting. Okay. And was that before, would have been before or after Katrina?
Before.
You had told me off camera earlier that the call, you said it sounded almost like there was primate-like notes to it, the way you heard it.
Yeah, I mean, it was kind of a, you know, it wasn't a elongated call. It was more of just like that kind of chimpanzee, like a, you know, what you would typically think as like a monkey, like a
right.
Ooh, ha, ha. You know, it would start out there and build and build and build till, you know, he was screaming his head off.
And your uncle would actually do this for you so you could hear it.
Yeah, several times. And, you know, one time actually he got kicked out of the house for it, because my grandmother got so mad at him and told him that he was never supposed to do that, you know, around her.
And then you've had something else. You've actually heard calls out here as well, right? When you took a friend hunting, correct?
No calls exactly.
Or you had some kind of, what was the incident where you had with you said you took a buddy out hunting?
Yeah, so last season, took my buddy out duck hunting in the Honey Island, and, you know, about 15 minutes before shooting light, so still really dark, you know, not being able to see anything on ground level. You know, we were sitting in a field that was bordered by a bunch of, you know, flooded land, and then a slough that kind of bordered the field that we're in, you know, making it a pretty good, you know, duck hunting spot. We could hear something coming through the woods, which is pretty common, you know. Everything sounds kind of loud, you know, but as time, you know, minutes got, you know, closer to shooting light, you know, it was getting louder and louder coming towards us. And then we can hear it actually enter into the bayou that's about 30 yards on the outside of, you know, the field we're sitting in, making its way through, and I can hear it coming up, you know, the embankment that's directly in front of us. At this point, I've already talked to my buddy and been like, do you hear this? You know, are you, you know, and this is actually the first time he's ever been hunting, so he didn't have any idea what was going on.
Right.
You know, all of a sudden, I guess it gets close enough that we can hear the water dripping off, and, you know, kind of heavy breathing. That probably lasts for about 10 seconds, and it takes off, you know, around the corner of, you know, the field that we're in, gets back into the canal or bayou, and it either sounded like he ran into a big down tree, or, you know, the creature ran into a tree, and, you know, or it could have picked something up and thrown it towards our direction, but it smashes this big tree, then proceeds to come out the other side, and you can just hear the water just dripping off of it the whole way. And as it runs through the woods, I mean, probably over the next 15 seconds, we can hear, very loud, tree breaks and, bushes being pushed over, and, until it, we didn't hear it anymore, and we were just, I don't know, just kind of dumbfounded about what had just happened,
After telling me his stories, Dave and I explored the area for a few hours, but it was a quiet night overall. Upon returning from Louisiana, in the following days and weeks, Dave relayed some even more recent stories he had heard from the area, including one from a hunting buddy of his who experienced the ransacking of their camping gear, as well as a deer carcass being thrown at them from the woods, and another experience from Dave's coworker, in which they encountered a large figure watching them as they hunted in the swamp. It seems that the stories from the swamp keep on flowing, especially from hunters, who spend arguably the most time out there out of anybody nowadays. So what exactly is the Honey Island Swamp Monster? Is it a real living creature that roams these remote corners of the Pearl River, or just something we have conjured up due to our misunderstanding and fear of swamps? Am I now any closer to the truth than I was before embarking on this journey? In some ways, both yes and no. Yes, in the sense that I experienced firsthand the rabbit hole this mystery can lead you down. No, in the sense that whatever is out there remains elusive. While the tale of the Honey Island Swamp Monster is a unique folkloric case, it is one that involves many characters and stories, some of which are true and some of which are false. The origin of the monster as we know it may very well come from those fake tracks made in the swamp decades ago, but the story goes far beyond that. As I experienced myself, the encounters continue to this day, and in a much wider context along the Pearl River and its offshoots, placing the Honey Island Swamp Monster within the overall Louisiana Sasquatch mystery. Regardless if you believe in the monster or not, it's the Honey Island Swamp itself that plays the largest role in this tale. More than once I was told how this was the most primitive of all swamps in Louisiana, which says a lot for a state filled with swamps. It seems that as long as there is a Honey Island Swamp, there will be stories of a monster, or even other mysteries lurking in its murky waters, in between the tall cypress trees.